Jimmy, Tim Banks said Tennessee's defensive line could be is the best in the country. Tennessee's defensive line, best in the country. What do you make of that statement?
I think that's the coach is trying to engender confidence in his unit to make them feel that they are look, and I think they're really good. It's hard for me to put them ahead of Georgia, which is just keeps cranking out defensive linemen, and I don't know what the rest of the nation has. Okay, maybe I'll have a better idea of who's returning at Michigan and all these other places. I don't know that. I do think it's one of the best in the SEC. It may be in the top 3 in the SEC, which is pretty darn good considering how good this league is at the line of scrimmage, in particular on the defensive line. But I think a lot of that is trying to pump up his players. Now, and I think he's got some good players. I think he's got some NFL caliber players. I don't think he's got a lot of first-round draft picks on the defensive line, except for James Pierce. I think he's got several middle-round picks, like an Omari Thomas, like a Norman-Lott. I think some of those guys, and maybe eventually some other guys develop into that. But I do think it's a quality defensive line, but I'm not prepared to agree to say it's the best defensive line in the country.
I'm prepared to say it can be. I think Tennessee has solid defensive tackles and a generational edge rusher and James Pierce. Jimmy, tell me if this comparison makes sense, what I'm about to do. I think Tennessee's front 4 now is kind of the reverse of the 2001 front 4, which I think we would all agree with Henderson and Haynesworth is that's the gold standard of elite defensive lines in college football, isn't it? Yes. That defensive line was the best defensive line in college football because of 2 generational tackles and 2 solid defensive ends in Will Overstreet and Bernard Jackson. I think it's the reverse this time where you might have a generational edge rusher in James Pierce, and you might have 2 with Joshua Josephs. Mm-hmm. And then solid defensive tackles in Amari Thomas, Omar Norman-Lott, Bryson Eason, go down the list. Is that a crazy comparison to say it's almost like the mirror of 2001 where it's just the ends versus the tackles where the elite talent is?
No, I think that's a good comparison. I think your edge rushers will be higher draft picks in the NFL than your tackles. Back then in 2001, your tackles were picked higher. If I'm not mistaken, Henderson was around the number 9 pick and Haynesworth 13 or 15.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
both of them were the top 15. That's highly unusual for a team to have 2 tackles that are taken that high. So yeah, I think that's a good comparison, and I could see Pierce in my mind is already there. Josephs could work his way into being an outstanding defensive end edge rusher who could be a high draft pick. Not there yet, but he could. So yeah, I think that's a good comparison.
I would have said, and I think you would have too, when you and I worked together, about 20 years ago, that it's better to be good in the interior at tackle than it is to be at the end. But the way the game has changed in those 20 years, as I age us, I'm not so sure that it hasn't flipped. You?
Yeah, I'd rather have the edge rushers. If I'm elite there, because you got to get after the quarterback. I think it's become more of a quarterback game than it was 20 years ago. Not that you didn't have some great quarterbacks, but now there are more quarterbacks who are mobile than used to be. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you got to have people on the edge like Pierce that can get to them. In Tennessee, I don't remember exactly the sack number, 36 sacks, whatever it was. I just know they were in the top 5 in the league in sacks last year, and they got after the quarterback pretty darn well. So, yeah, I would say now I would rather have elite edge rushers than tackles on the front 4.
So none of us, though, are saying that you would trade Pearson, Josephs for Haynesworth and Henderson, right?
No, because I'd take Pierce as good as any of them. But Josephs has not reached that level yet. So, no, I would take Haynesworth and Henderson over Pierce and Josephs at this time.
Good stuff. Caleb, jump in here. That's pretty strong right there.
Yeah, I agree. Also, because there's so many zone reads now, so many running plays are stretch running plays that almost a lot of times the edge rushers are more responsible for it. I think the most important thing for the tackles is just they're almost borderline decoys in this point. They just have to make sure they command the presence of the interior blockers. to do their job. So looking at that, are we being unfair to the tackles though? I mean, we're saying all this out loud, but Amari Thomas can play and he's a great leader of the team. I do believe he has a bit of a ceiling, but Norman-Lott could be. He had a very good first year playing for Rodney Garner last year, and he could take a step forward. Are we looking at James Pierce? We're talking All-American like potential, and maybe another edge rusher could be All-American. I think they could, but are we looking at first team All-SEC potential, Jimmy, with Amari Thomas, Norman-Lott, and those guys?
I think you're looking at that potentially. I guess my step was, where are they going to go in the NFL draft? I don't think I think they're middle round draft picks right now. They may emerge and be better than that. Gosh, I remember years ago, I'm sure y'all do too, Tennessee had a player named Dan Williams, who somebody on the staff said, this guy can't play defense and needs to be an offensive lineman. And then he developed into a first-round draft pick by the Cardinals, I think.
That's right. And I thought the same thing. I thought this guy's headed straight to the offensive line.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is the defensive tackles are not a finished product. Now, having said that, and I like Amari Thomas. I think he's a quality defensive tackle. But if he projected to be taken that high, I think he would have entered the draft. So I think they're good, really solid players. Without knowing all the other personnel and what's going to happen to the transfer portal, I might take Tennessee's 2 defensive tackles over anybody else in the SEC. That just remains to be seen as to who ends up winding up at Georgia and Alabama and Texas and these other schools.
I want to give you the player that I think is the key for that interior, and tell me what you think of him. Again, Jimmy's appearance brought to you by our good friends at Varner Ford in Clinton.
Welcome to Varner Ford in Clinton, where every turn meets new possibilities and every mile celebrates the cutting-edge innovation within our Ford lineup. Elevate your journey in this new 2023 F-150 4x4 Super Cab, $44,992. A 2023 Ford Escape all-wheel drive, $30,952. 2023 F-150 4x4 Super Crew XLT, $54,900. Local you trust, innovation you can afford. Varner Ford, your East Tennessee Ford dealership.
One of the strongest guys on the team, but one of the least productive is Elijah Simmons. I was told just banged up. But if there was one player on Tennessee's entire team that I think could most elevate themselves, at least in my mind, because I already like Nico. I like a lot of the guys that are out there. It would be Simmons. I think he can go from incredibly not dependable to a really solid all-SEC player. You?
What's kept him back? I don't know the answer to that. So
I've been told he's been constantly beat up, that he's had minor injuries the whole time. Is what I've been told.
Yeah. So here's a guy that, and I don't know the extent of a lot of the injuries, and I know he's been banged up. I get all that, but has he lacked motivation? Is that a part of it? Is he committed to wanting to be a great defensive player? I don't know the answer to that. But to your point, and I'll refer back to a great defensive lineman Tennessee had, and I'll just tell you the story I was told. But I'm wondering this. Okay, Elijah Simmons, do you want to make money in the NFL? If you do, now's the time. If that doesn't motivate you, I don't know what will. I'll tell you this, Reggie White was a very good player his first couple of years at Tennessee, but his senior year, he elevated to where he was probably the best defensive player in the country. And I was told in part was, okay, Reggie, here's your money year. And he took off. And he showed what a great player he was with a great ability. Now, Simmons doesn't have that talent, okay? Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is maybe the fact that he can be an NFL draft pick and make some money will motivate him to have a better season this year.
It's official. Jimmy just said Elijah Simmons is the next Reggie White.
Don't put that out there. Caleb, does he do that to you too?
All the time. What
are we going to do with this guy?
But Jimmy, I'll help you out though, because we can actually do it on a much less extreme example, because I think that happened to Darnell Wright too on the offensive line 2 years ago.
Yeah,
I think you're right.